Bueno, buena tarde a tothom. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Welcome, Nicole Aschoff, to Foros 2020 lecture series, Co-Benefits. And thank you very much for participating with your lecture, Smartphones, Smart Cities, and the Digital Frontier. Buenas tardes, Freddy Massat.
Hola, buenas tardes, Guillem, ¿cómo va?
Y bienvenidos una vez más a todos a los que estáis conectados. Y afrontamos esta semana la penúltima de las conferencias del ciclo en streaming Foros 2020 Co-Benefits, Beneficios Colaterales, organizado por la UIC Barcelona School of Architecture, y hoy con la intervención de Nicole Aschoff, que nos planteará seguro muchos interrogantes relacionados con, entre otras cosas, este dispositivo. Un dispositivo que prácticamente se ha convertido en un apéndice de nuestro cuerpo. Más allá de comunicarnos, eliminar las distancias físicas, el smartphone forma parte de un marco más amplio como es el de la vigilancia y el control de datos. El smartphone forma parte también de un sistema más amplio que privilegia el seguimiento y el control de los usuarios. Pagar un bien de consumo, reservar una plaza de aparcamiento, reservar un lugar en un restaurante, organizar nuestro calendario, mantener el contacto con nuestras amistades, todo ello son operaciones que implican un gran intercambio de datos en la red. Pero, ¿cómo se aprovecha el sistema de los rastros que difícilmente podemos borrar de manera completa? ¿Se justifica la aportación indiscriminada de datos personales como pago que presta una determinada aplicación en el smartphone? Y por otra parte, ¿somos conscientes de la capacidad como herramienta de comunicación social? En definitiva, ¿somos conscientes de la capacidad de los smartphones para redefinir la construcción de la sociedad actual? Bien, pues de todo ello nos hablará Nicole Aschoff. Paso la palabra a nuestro compañero Freddy Massat, que os trazará un perfil de la invitada.
Okay, thank you very much, Guillem. Thank you very much, Nicole, for accepting the invitation to participate in Foros. Bueno, les cuento brevemente quién es Nicole. Nicole Aschoff es socióloga, escritora y editora. Es autora de ensayos como Smartphone, Society, Technology, Power and Resistance in the New Gilded Age and the New Prophets of Capital. Este libro es el por el cual la conocí y me pareció muy interesante, y el momento me parece que era el adecuado para que hiciera esta conferencia. Me parece que es una conferencia que viene muy a cuento de lo que está pasando hoy, ¿no? Aschoff es doctora en sociología por la Universidad de Johns Hopkins y actualmente es editora general de la revista Jacobin, editora en jefe del Boston Institute for Non-Profit Journalism. Seguimos la conferencia. Nicole va a empezar ahora su conferencia. Como siempre, después de la conferencia, Marcos de Espíritu Santo le trasladará a Nicole las preguntas que ustedes vayan enviando a través del chat. Y bueno, Nicole, it's your turn. Thank you very much for being here, and then we talk when you finish.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to join you all today from across the way, and I'd like to talk a little bit about some new research. So I'm just going to pull up my screen here, and you'll see me apparently still, but I'm going to just see my slideshow. The title of my talk today is Smartphones, Smart Cities, and the Digital Frontier. And I put my email address on here, so if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and send me an email afterward. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today, or at least some of it, is drawing from my new book called The Smartphone Society. So if you're interested in some of the stuff I'm talking about today, you can send me an email and I'll give you some more kind of articles that I've written, or you can just check out my new book. But so I'm very happy to be here today, and as the medium of this talk aptly demonstrates, the coronavirus has certainly strengthened our bond with our digital devices. When people in China were driven indoors in February, they downloaded about 200 million apps or more. Many of you have perhaps been digging into Netflix's virtually bottomless catalog of shows. Thanks to a decade of cheap credit, you'll never run out of shows on Netflix. They have about 15 million new subscribers. But perhaps the digital device that we're most attached to in this crisis, or perhaps this is just my own thinking, is our smartphones, right? We might be using our phones to keep up to date with information from our local governments, international health agencies. Perhaps on a darker note, we're obsessively using our phones to track state and country infection and death totals. But in a more positive sense, we're using our smartphones to stay in touch with our friends and family. But we can also see how governments are using our phones to combat the virus in a variety of ways. And I pulled up this map here, which was made by the folks over at 10. And Dave Gershgorn has a great article where he just sort of tracks down what countries are doing to actually ramp up surveillance to help combat the coronavirus. And a lot of the surveillance is being enacted through our phones. So in the United States, the White House, in partnership with the Center for Disease Control, has begun tracking American smartphones to see where they're going using aggregate location data. For example, recently data analysts saw that a lot of people were congregating in Brooklyn's Prospect Park, so they alerted the police. In Brazil, favela residents are receiving messages, WhatsApp messages from their local crime bosses because of course, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is not a believer in the dangers of the coronavirus. Israel's Secret Service is logging the movements of everyone who has tested positive for the virus. Poland is using smartphones, asking people who are self-quarantining to send a selfie to prove that they are at home. They have to send a selfie to police within 20 minutes or so of receiving a prompt from government officials. In South Korea, individuals who have tested positive for coronavirus have seen their personal information made public, so others can determine whether they have been in proximity with them. And as we talk about ways to combat the resurgence of the virus, whether it's next winter or thinking about future pandemics, certainly the idea of using our smartphones, whether it's for contact tracing or heat maps, is becoming an intense topic of conversation. And we see the role of governments, of course, but we also see this partnership of governments with private corporations. In China, Alibaba was partnered with the Chinese government to create a new tracking system that was implemented around the country very quickly. And in the United States, certainly Google, Facebook, Amazon, Palantir, Clearview AI are working in conjunction with the White House and the CDC and the National Institutes of Health to model the virus outbreak and to develop ways to monitor people who have been infected with the virus. Apple and Google, of course, are cracking down on coronavirus apps in their Play stores, deleting informational apps except for those provided by recognized health organizations. But when we look at these partnerships, it can make people a bit uneasy, in large part because some of the companies that are being contracted, particularly Palantir, which is known for spying. It spies for the NSA. It's partially funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. It has contracts with ICE. Certainly, this newer company, Clearview AI, which is a very secretive facial recognition startup that has hundreds of law enforcement agencies in the United States as its clients, and actually, has caused a lot of alarm and calls to ban facial recognition by computer scientists. And when we think about these companies, who many of them don't have a very good reputation when it comes to privacy, we really start to, think about what is this relationship between public health and surveillance, particularly surveillance through our smartphones, and really starting to question how the issues of public health and surveillance have become inseparable very quickly. And, we have to start to ask ourselves, is privacy being jettisoned for the greater good? Is the trade-off worth it? Some would say yes, a sort of qualified yes, for the simple reason that countries that have adopted smartphone surveillance seem to have gotten a handle on the virus a little bit more quickly and more effectively. But others are very concerned, and I put myself in this category, that surveillance will remain after the pandemic has been suppressed. Yuval Noah Harari had a piece in the Financial Times where he argued that we can't assume that temporary measures, such as biometric surveillance, will go away after the emergency is over. Temporary measures, he contended, have a nasty habit of outlasting emergencies, especially as there's always a new emergency lurking on the horizon. Adam Schwartz, who is a senior lawyer at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, echoed this fear in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. He said, "We understand that given we are in a crisis, that some temporary adjustment to our digital liberties may be necessary. However, it's really important that those adjustments be temporary." And Amnesty International actually recently released a joint statement with more than 100 civil society groups warning governments not to use the pandemic as a cover to usher in a new era of greatly expanded systems of invasive digital surveillance. The fear that bespoke surveillance developed to combat the coronavirus may linger is a legitimate one. We should keep a close tally on what surveillance measures, both voluntary and involuntary, have been implemented during the crisis, so that when the smoke clears, we can gauge how privacy may have been altered. But it's also important not to overstate the distinction between now and before. To get an accurate sense of the shifting privacy landscape, it's important to recognize that both the good things and the bad things that we're getting from our smartphones during this crisis are possible only because we've already developed a deep and complex relationship with digital technology, a relationship that's grounded in surveillance. So if you think about the hardware and the software that make our phones so indispensable, this hardware and software is already tracking us 24 hours a day, every day. So for example, the coronavirus apps that use geolocation data to determine whether individuals are practicing social distancing or staying inside their quarantine zone are only possible because our phones are designed to provide precise geolocation data that companies like Google currently harvest and store forever. If you're carrying your phone, Google can tell precisely where you are at all times, give or take. Tap your Maps app, for example, and Google will take a snapshot of where you were when you opened it. Anytime you do a search, it not only stores the contents of the search query, but also where you were when you made the query. Researchers at Princeton confirmed that even if you used Google's privacy tools on both Android and iPhones to ask Google not to track your location, it did so anyway. Simply put, algorithms gorge on data about you every second of every day. And of course, it's not just Google. It's Facebook, it's third-party data brokers, it's internet service providers, it's all of the apps that you give permission to. All of these companies, these tech companies, are tracking us through our phones 24 hours a day, every single day. So really, if we think about it, it's hard to overstate how much tech companies know about us. But more than this, if we think about sort of this, the nuts and bolts of tracking people through their smartphones, More than this, the constellation of norms and behaviors that facilitate a ready willingness to snap a selfie, say for facial recognition, or to use an app to track and report potential signs of illness. These types of norms and behaviors were developed long before the coronavirus. We use Face ID to unlock our phones. We post selfies on Instagram and get tagged on Facebook using the social media giant's cutting-edge facial recognition capabilities. We self-monitor with period and sleep trackers, meditation apps, and biorhythm calculators. In this crisis, governments and companies are relying on these habits and expectations. They're adapting our existing relationships with our smartphones to serve the end of quelling the viral outbreak. Indeed, the ease with which these habits and expectations have become repurposed to fight this virus is evidence of how ingrained they've become, as smartphones have become ubiquitous over the past decade. Often when we think about the norms and behaviors associated with our smartphones, we frame them in a very negative way. We talk about addiction, we talk about our inability to control our impulses, the sort of, we describe our relationship with our phones as we would to a drug, right, or to a kind of, biological, framing, right? We resort to Cartesian dualisms, right? We think about the mind-body divide. And these are critiques that have historically been associated with technology, particularly new technology. So if we go back and look at people's reaction to the cinema, to radio and television, we see similar types of framings. And while these types of framings, right, that emphasize this kind of mind-body divide are not necessarily useless, I think they can encourage us to lose sight of the kind of bigger process of what's happening. When we think about both the nuts and bolts of the data collection that's occurring, but also the norms and behaviors that we associate with our digital devices, particularly our smartphones. When we think about the adding up of these behaviors over time, right? The swipes and taps and easy slides into pockets and purses as we move along through our days and years, all of these add up to something huge. And as I argue in my book and elsewhere, these things add up to a new frontier for global capitalism. Now, I put this picture on here because this is where the east and west of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States met in 1869, I believe. When we think about capitalism, right, and frontiers, they kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're linked together so often that we usually picture frontiers in terms of their subsumption into the ever-spreading for-profit system. And we imagine frontiers, right? We call them the New World, right? Or the American West. And we describe and discuss these frontiers in sort of dominant frames, right? That locate change in technological advance, like railroads or smartphones. But often the language that we use to understand frontiers and change in capitalism more broadly is a bit too passive. We lose sense of how frontiers are actually created, right? They're not opened. They're not just sort of there to be exploited and profited from. We make them, right? Often in a very bloody, disruptive process. And while it's tempting to locate change, within technological advances, we need to remember that technology is not what's driving change. People are driving change, right? It's easy to fall into kind of technologically determinist arguments. So if we're thinking about people, we're putting people in the driver's seat, and you can see in this picture there are a lot of people here. Where are people in capitalism? Well, often if we think about this question in our mind, we might locate people as entrepreneurs. We might locate them or identify them as wage workers working in a factory or a mine. But this is only part of the picture, right? We have to also think about people who don't work for a wage, right? And when we think about the creation of frontiers, we rightfully imagine all of the unpaid work that goes into them, the work done by slaves and colonial subjects. But we should also think about the work done by women, unpaid work. So Jason Moore, in a very good book called Capitalism and the Web of Life, thinks about this unpaid work. And he argues that absent massive streams of unpaid work or energy from the rest of nature, the costs of production would rise and accumulation would slow. So he's thinking about change over time and arguing that we can, if we want to understand how capitalism expands, we can't just think about wage work. We have to think about unpaid work as well. Only a small fraction of the work that goes into creating new frontiers is paid work. And the appropriation of unpaid work is as essential to capitalism as paid work. Now, why am I thinking about this? Well, right now when we think about frontiers, often the way that we think about the earth, and this is a very American reference here. I put this picture, it says The End. This is from a very famous children's book called The Giving Tree, written by Shel Silverstein. And in the story, this tree gives everything that it can, and in the end, it has nothing more to give. And we often think about this in terms of the earth, right? That we have sort of exploited the planet, right? The voracious appetites of capitalism have been so great that there are no more frontiers to open. Right? When we think about new spaces to profit from, often we have the sense that there are no more new spaces. Well, this is an interesting debate, and certainly if we think about the limits of the digital frontier, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end, this is something that we have to ask ourselves. But nonetheless, Silicon Valley has found a new frontier, and it's using your smartphone to both create this frontier and to profit from it. And unpaid labor, unpaid work is a key part of this story, just like in all of the past frontiers that have been opened and created and profited from, the digital frontier is no different. So let's think about how this actually works. Just an example, if you think about Instagram, right? It sold for $1 billion, despite only employing about 13 people. Facebook also bought WhatsApp for $19 billion, despite the company only employing about 50 people. This is an astonishing sum of money. Why are these companies worth so much? Now, of course, we have to consider the fact that the cost of capital has been incredibly low since the 2008 crisis. But even setting this aside, why are these companies worth so much? Well, most observers will say these companies are so valuable because of their network potential, right? The potential of linking many, many people. This is true, but it's also obfuscatory. The value of these companies is in the unpaid work they command. It's in their ability to appropriate life, your life. Of course, the appropriation of unpaid work is not new. And I think if you're interested in frontiers and unpaid work, I highly recommend Silvia Federici's path-breaking book, Caliban and the Witch. And in that book, she talks about the transition to feudalism. She illuminates how women's unpaid labor became concealed, transforming the process of accumulation and thus power relations for both men and women. And she talks about how the concealment of how important women's unpaid labor was to capitalism allowed both men and women to be oppressed. women's work began to appear as a natural resource available to all. In the development of the digital frontier, we are once again seeing a redefinition of life activities and the emergence of new power dynamics. A new combination of appropriation and exploitation has been formulated. Appropriation we can think of as the appropriation of unpaid work, and exploitation in the classic Marxian sense as wage work. So unpaid work and paid work, a new combination of this. And this model has generated unimaginable wealth for the tech titans. Certainly, if we think about just since the start of this year, the people who have gained billions of dollars in new money, right, in new earnings, new profits, new wealth, are actually these tech titans, right? People like Zuckerberg and Bezos. If we think about the digital frontier, right, and in relationship to these historical frontiers, right, the transition to feudalism is just one example. We're once again witnessing the concealment of unpaid, appropriated work. Except today, it's not just women's work that is being appropriated, being made to appear as a natural resource or a labor of love. It is all of our work. The hours we spend every day on our smartphones creating content and generating data through our constant connection to our digital devices. Now, our appropriated work and our digital selves more broadly, I argue, are the key to the digital frontier. Put simply, we generate the data on which this frontier rests, right? And it's the very simple, if not very elegant name, big data, right? And observers of big data, or big data enthusiasts, when we think about the data that we generate, they see an endless horizon of exploitation and profitability and innovation, right? Data, in a way that it never was in the past, is now considered valuable. It's extremely valuable. What was once frivolous and useless has become precious. Big data companies and third-party data vendors are amassing, hoarding, trading, selling, and extracting data like gold. Yasha Levine, who has written a great book on surveillance and the US military, calls this a new form of alchemy. And I put on here this this NROL satellite picture just to remind you, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, but when we think about this, this digital frontier, we have to remember not to fall into the mindset that this is a frontier that is existing only in the market, or that it's something that's emerging only from corporations, right? We have to always remind ourselves that companies and governments work together, not only to create the conditions for capitalism, but also to create the conditions for the creation of new frontiers. So like the Transcontinental Railroad and the conquering of the American West, the use of the military to suppress and murder indigenous people to create space for the railroad, for example. The digital frontier is made through a deep partnership between Silicon Valley and the US government and the US military. This partnership is not always visible, but it has become more visible in recent years, thanks in no small part to Edward Snowden, whose revelations were deeply embarrassing for both the US government and US tech companies. But of course, even in this moment, right, we see this partnership today in the interlinking of public health and surveillance through our smartphones. So if we're thinking about the digital frontier, this is just the beginning, right? Our smartphones are unlocking a much bigger future. And so I wanted to get you thinking, particularly because many of you are interested in architecture, not about this very small device, but about the relationship that our smartphones and other digital devices reveal. And when we start to think about these relationships, we can look at much bigger processes and understand how institutions and power and social norms and profit making fit together in a bigger sense. So I put a picture here of this new project that is being undertaken by Sidewalk Labs. It was formerly part of a subsidiary of Google, but now both Google and Sidewalk Labs have been kind of lumped into this bigger conglomerate called Alphabet, which I'm sure many of you already know. But this project, which started in 2017 and is ongoing, is a redevelopment project being undertaken by Sidewalk Labs in the city of Toronto. The idea is that Sidewalk Labs will win the rights to develop a section of the Toronto waterfront and create what it's calling its first smart city, right? The idea, right, is that it's not officially Google, but there are many Google folks involved in the project. Just to give you a sense, so at the project's launch, Eric Schmidt described how Googlers had long fantasized about all the things they could do if someone would just give them a city and put them in charge. Well, they're hoping with this neighborhood they're calling Quayside, that they finally gotten their wish. They're in the process of getting sort of final approval to do this project right now. So Quayside, according to Sidewalk Labs, will be the world's first neighborhood built from the internet up. It bills itself as the city of the future. Ubiquitous sensors and cameras will gauge resident flow, traffic, and weather. Self-driving vehicles will radically reduce the need for personal car ownership. Residents will relax in tall timber plug-and-play buildings serviced by underground trash and delivery robots. And of course, all of this data will be buttressed by smartphone data, right? Everyone will be carrying around their smartphones and linking in to sensors and cameras and all around the city, creating essentially Quayside is seen as a kind of laboratory, right, to develop a new city platform model, a city-scale Android phone, as it's been said, that Alphabet can someday license and sell to other cities around the world. And allegedly, Alphabet and Sidewalk Labs have what's called the Yellow Book, where they talk about some of their ideas to start with Toronto, to start with Quayside, and to develop this model that they can then, translate to other cities, this kind of smart city model. Of course, the idea of the company town, right, is not new. And I put up two pictures here. The top one is a picture of Pullman's company town, George Pullman. And the bottom is a picture of Fordlandia in Brazil, which was a project designed by Henry Ford to make the perfect town to produce and live in the Ford way. So Alphabet executives follow a long line of corporate dreamers. Of course, these men and their eponymous industrial communities are familiar in no small part because their experiments failed. Company towns were designed to solve the ills of industrial capitalism: blight, shoddy housing, and most of all, a disgruntled, politicized, militant workforce. Instead, they quickly demonstrated the dystopian reality of unchecked corporate power. These failures notwithstanding, the tech titans of today are trying to build their own company towns, right? But they're thinking of them as smart cities. They're imagining them as a very different beast, right? From something like Pullman's Pullman's Paradise or Fordlandia. So Facebook is building a new city in Silicon Valley called Willow Village between Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. Reporters have called it Zucktown, which Mark Zuckerberg does not appreciate, apparently. Bill Gates bought 25,000 acres in Arizona to construct Belmont, the city of the future. And cryptocurrency millionaire Jeffrey Burns purchased 67,000 acres outside of Reno, Nevada, to erect a blockchain utopia. These are just some of the examples, right? So Sidewalk Labs is not alone. There's a real push and a lot of excitement about the concept of smart cities. Of course, the smartest city in the world currently is Songdo in Korea. It's majority owned by Gale International, which is a private real estate developer based in New York City. Songdo is built in Incheon, South Korea, on land reclaimed from the Yellow Sea. It boasts a pneumatic trash system, a state-of-the-art water recycling facility, traffic and energy use sensors, remote touchscreen regulation, and vast green spaces. But despite its description as a sustainable, low-carbon, high-tech utopia, Songdo is curiously empty. Its pristine, wide avenues and replica of New York City's Central Park are often deserted. If you start to dig into and read accounts about Songdo, there are a remarkable number of comparisons to Chernobyl. And residents who live there report feelings of isolation and loneliness and complain that the city is unaffordable, or that the design of the city, right, this sort of smart design is not something that they would have chosen, that it doesn't really fit the way that they want to live their lives. Designers, tech companies, engineers have paid a lot of attention, particularly to Songdo, and argue that they have learned from that example, particularly learned what not to do. Right? They promise that, and this is a picture of the Quayside project of what planners are imagining that it might look like. It looks pretty beautiful, and they assure us, right, that this smart city will be built for people. Right? They vow to accelerate urban innovation and serve as a beacon for cities around the world. Seeking to assuage fears that ubiquitous surveillance is the flip side of ubiquitous connectivity, Sidewalk Labs head of urban systems, Rohit Agarwala, reassured skeptics. He said, "Our objective is to build a great neighborhood. The only reason we want to capture information is to provide better urban services." So unlike top-down visions of the past, like Songdo, Sidewalk Labs promises transparency and openness. In a Reddit Ask Me Anything, one participant asked Dan Doctoroff, who's the head of the project, about the first thing he would build in Quayside, and he answered, a statue of Jane Jacobs, which is really rich, considering that Jane Jacobs was a powerful advocate for a people-centered city and against corporate power. So he's, by making this reference to her, he's assuring skeptics that Sidewalk Labs has internalized the critiques that she made and is ready to make a city for everyone. In this corporate story, consensus goals of sustainability, affordability, mobility, economic opportunity become interwoven with and inseparable from Sidewalk Labs' business plan. The sweeping privatization of new spheres of life, made possible by the corporate-led reorganization of urban space, is presented as the creation of an inclusive green community built in the interests of everyone. Now, we should be very upfront here and say this type of city, when we look at this picture, this looks amazing, right? People want sustainable cities. They want less pollution, fewer cars, green jobs. And certainly if we look at city and state governments, they aren't exactly falling all over each other to provide these things. On the contrary, in the United States, many cities are characterized by crumbling infrastructure and budgets that are, completely stretched thin. City governments and state governments are either unable or unwilling to actually create these kinds of cities. So there's something very attractive about a company like Sidewalk Labs or Alphabet more broadly to come in and say, we will build the city of your dreams, right? This is something that really makes people want to sit up and listen. But I think that we have to be very careful and aware of the social relations that are embodied, not just in our smartphones, as I've argued, but also in our cities, right? Humanity is increasingly urbanized. As cities open up new opportunities for data generation and collection. As we go about our lives in urban spaces, in our homes, at work, on the streets, in the shops and subways, most of us are umbilically attached to our smartphones. We generate data with every step, search, and swipe. With ubiquitous sensors and smart devices, all synced to our own smartphones, companies like Sidewalk Labs stand to generate unprecedented data and to create new ways of extracting data from life. Now, I put these three pictures up here. This picture on my right of this cute little robot here is actually a new robot that has been created and put into use during the coronavirus in China. It not only cleans the floors, it checks people's temperatures in the nearby, radius of the robot, and it also makes sure that people are wearing their masks. In the middle here, I have, of course, an Amazon Alexa. I guess this is an Echo, which is a smaller version. But we can think about if we think about our smartphones as just one device in the Internet of Things, right? We can start to think about all of the other kinds of devices that we're bringing into our lives, such as the Alexa, right? Which is an always on, always listening data collection device that's in our homes, right? We put them in our living rooms, in our bedrooms, and our kitchens, and they're always on, listening, collecting, and finding out more and more about us. In exchange, they provide us some songs, I guess, a recipe. They tell us what the weather is. They make it easier for us to purchase things. And then I put this picture of the first edition of Ubik, just for those of you, many of you I'm sure have read Ubik, but if you remember in the beginning of Ubik, Joe Chip, right, he lives in what is effectively a smart city. He lives in a smart apartment, and he doesn't have the nickel that he needs to pay the door to open, so he can't get out of his apartment, which I think is interesting, right? Certainly when we imagine our future, whether it's a utopia or a dystopia, the dystopian elements are something that many of us have thought about, but we should take very seriously as we examine projects like Quayside and Sidewalk Labs. Because as tech companies quantify and commodify new spheres of life, transforming them into private property, whether it's through our smartphones or these smart cities, the city has emerged as a key site in the digital frontier, right? Quayside is just one episode in a much larger reorganization of power in the 21st century. Alphabet / Google, Facebook, Amazon, these companies are the purveyors of much of the infrastructure undergirding modern social, political, and economic life. We depend on them. Our dependence has put them in a position of unprecedented power, the power to enclose and appropriate new spaces, both digital and analog, and they are actively doing so. The tech titans present themselves and their technology as inevitable. They expect and demand ever greater access to our cities, our communities, and ourselves. And they claim that they are building sustainable cities that will benefit everyone. But I think that we need to be clear on what is actually happening here. If we think about the example of Sidewalk Labs and Quayside is not a commons, right? Sidewalk Labs isn't creating a commons. Far from it. Its goal is to make a profit for its parent company. At the end of the day, the primary aim of Sidewalk Labs and all of the other Silicon Valley giants is designing and selling technology, enclosing and profiting from the emergent digital frontier. Now, this seems like a fairly obvious point, but when we look at the kinds of stories that are being told, listen to the stories that are being told, look at the materials that are being produced by these tech companies, it's actually easy to lose sight of this basic fact, because all of the language in the stories are about creating inclusive spaces, using technology to make our lives better, having sort of big picture projects that are not about such mundane things like making profits, right? The story is always about a greater ideal, a greater future. But Silicon Valley ideals, ubiquitous surveillance, the datafication and commodification of everything, are not the values on which to build the city of the future. Like all corporate visions for remaking urban spaces, and we can think about opportunity zones, redevelopment schemes, charter cities, all of these kinds of visions about future cities dreamed up by these tech titans are about benefiting a small number of people, right? Creating and generating profits. They're not about benefiting, everyone or creating a common space, right? This idea of the commons. Now, when we think about frontiers, often when we imagine the frontier, and if we look historically at frontiers, the imaginary is of the infinite, right? The endless frontier. We think about space, right? Or if we look at the settler colonialists who landed in the United States, on the shores of the United States, and they looked at the forests, right? They thought that the forests were infinite. Thomas Jefferson thought that it would take 1,000 years to reach the Pacific. Of course, they were wrong. And the reason why is that there are always limits, right, to every frontier. And the digital frontier is no exception. There are limits. And we can think about a number of these, right? In the most basic sense, we can think about the ecological limits, right, to the digital frontier. The way that we imagine the cloud, for example, as this kind of light, puffy, puff of air that just sort of exists and is endless, is of course radically divorced from the reality of the cloud, which is wires and cables and secret, data servers, often in old military bunkers. Or if we think about the carbon footprint of the global ICT sector, right? It's huge and growing quickly. So we can imagine the kind of ecological limits of the digital frontier. We can also imagine the technological limits, right? This idea that big data is endlessly valuable, right? We can always find new things to do with it, and always mine it for more value is of course not true. Data becomes stale. We need new, fresh data. We need to constantly generate new data, which is why the innovations that are pushed by tech companies are often about getting us to share more, right? To generate more data. Uber, for example, changed for a short while its app to, instead of asking people to say where they wanted to go by the location of the place they wanted to go, they asked them to say what friend or place they were going to visit, and to keep tracking them for 5 minutes after they were dropped off to see exactly where they went. Users found out about this and pushed back on it, so the company stopped doing it. But it's just one little example of how companies are always asking us to share more is because there are actually technological limits, right? We need to constantly create fresh data. But there are also social limits, right? If we think about, if we go back to this idea about women's unpaid work, right? This idea of women's work being a natural resource available for all. Well, this is an idea that, was the norm for hundreds of years, right? And it wasn't really until the 20th century that the feminist movement and women's movements and labor movement together over time really started to actually call this norm into question, right? And to call into question the idea that unpaid work had no value, right? And it became a social and political question, right? This question of this issue of unpaid work. So when we think about the social limits of the digital frontier, this will give us a sense of sort of what are some of the things that are happening now, right? In terms of pushing back against this vision that the tech companies have of the datafication and the commodification of everything. So tech companies, they like to cloak themselves and their projects in an air of inevitability, but the ease of appropriating our unpaid work is not a given, right? It is a social and a political arrangement that is subject to change, right? We can actually push back against this. And I put up here this slide, which is Block Sidewalk, which is a group of Toronto residents that has taken issue with Sidewalk Labs in a big way. And they have for several years have been organizing and really persistently questioning and challenging the development goals of Sidewalk Labs. If you've read City of Quartz by Mike Davis, he has this great quote. He argues that greater equity in urban space, including the basic right to remain in the city of one's birth or choice, requires radical interference with rights of private property. So a group like Block Sidewalk is really taking that to heart. And they're actually, people are listening to them, they're inserting themselves into the conversation, and they're having a real impact on Sidewalk Labs and Alphabet's ability to just kind of take this space, to appropriate this space, and to do what they want for it. Block Sidewalk is forcing the question of why all of this, data needs to be appropriated, why there needs to be ubiquitous sensors and cameras everywhere, and what kind of a plan, who is this plan for, right? Is it for people who live there, or is it for these tech companies? And we can think about a number of other examples, right? Block Sidewalk is just one. We can think about in the United States, Queens, residents really pushed back to keep Amazon from opening a distribution center there, fearful of the impact it would have on housing prices. In Berlin, residents organized against Google. They started a campaign called Fuck Off Google, again, to keep Google from opening a huge facility in their neighborhood, fearful again of the price of the impact on housing prices. These rejections, and these are just a few, signal not only broad disgust over the corporate giveaway norms of neoliberal capitalism, but also growing distrust and fear of the power that tech companies have to remake both digital and analog spaces and places. They point to the growing centrality of tech in fresh struggles over what has long been called the right to the city. David Harvey argues, and he's absolutely right, that the idea of the right to the city is an empty signifier. He says everything depends on who gets to fill it with meaning, and this is true. These days, tech companies and property developers are providing most of the meaning. In Sidewalk Labs' technocratic vision, for example, ubiquitous connectivity, data-driven management, these are seen as the key to improving urban life. And their materials and their story is so slick because because it taps into these fears and these desires we have to create sustainable cities that work for everyone, right? We want to be able to harness technology to make our cities better. That is a legitimate and real desire that people have. But if we think back to the things that actually make cities livable today, right? Public water utilities, public schools, parks, pollution restrictions, restrictions on traffic. These are things that were championed by progressives historically, right? And the contemporary moment. They're championed by progressives, radicals, and grassroots movements, right? Social movements. The struggle over the right to the city will only be won if we fill it with our own meaning, right? Which includes taking what's ours, but also really having a sense of, what it means to create a space for everyone, right? And to think about, architecture and the power of design in the context of the structures of our society, right? In the context of capitalism. Because if we think about design, right? Design and architecture more specifically, but we can also think about, the engineering and the design of our, our smartphones. This reflects social relations, right? Whether it's the design of our phones or our cities or any number of other devices. These things, right? They reflect power, right? They give us a picture of society, and they're inseparable from capitalism, right? So in that way, our smartphones and our cities are each a site of struggle. And in understanding them as a site of struggle, right, we can start to see them and our role in shaping them as much more important, right? Rather than just a kind of passive device or a passive project, we can see that they're, embedded. Whether it's our phone or our city, right? It's embedded with a set of institutions and relationships and networks that not only define the present moment, but where we're moving, right? So if we think about design and power within capitalism, we can start to really ask questions about what kind of a relationship we want to have with technology, right? And how that will, shape our projects, whether it's, this emerging question about surveillance and our relationship to the state, or whether it's a question about what kinds of spaces that we want to create, right? Relationships and spaces, and understanding that we cannot understand these without thinking about power and without embedding them in the structures of our society. So that's all I have for you now in terms of the talk, but I'm happy to answer questions. And yeah, all right, great.
Okay, good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Good morning, Nicole. Thank you for such an interesting lecture. I would like now to start a small debate on the lecture by asking you some questions from our students and also from some other members of the audience. So let me check here. We can start by this question by Sofia. Do you think the tracking of users that the government makes with this coronavirus situation is ethical?
Well, this is a really big question, right? Sort of, I think that the key about, the key way to think about what is ethical and what is not ethical is to demand that the relationships that we're developing and the things that people are being asked by their governments, whether it's they're being asked to download apps to voluntarily track themselves, right, and the context that they have. This is something that creates trust and a positive type of relationships. On the other hand, if companies and governments are tracking us and using our phone data without our permission, right, in the name of public health, I think that this is not ethical and lays the groundwork for a relationship moving forward, that is very troublesome and will make people much less likely to trust, future projects and future endeavors to actually use technology to help fight, future pandemics or the resurgence of this in the next, year or so.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Joaquin Bonet, he asks, do you see a trend line towards technocratic totalitarian governments as smart devices become more common?
Well, this is a great question, and I think here we need to be careful how we frame the situation, right? And not to fall into kind of technological determinism. So on the one hand, we do see, attacks on democracy, right-wing populist success, more totalitarianism, and we also see the increase in smart devices and people using digital platforms to create to engage in social movements and to do politics, right? But these two are not necessarily related in a causal way, right? We have to be sure not to say that our use of digital devices is causing this type of politics. Instead, we should see both of these things, right? Both the upsurge of sort of digital analog political organizing all around the world, and this kind of political battles between right-wing and left-wing populists and the crisis of neoliberalism, both as the result of a broader crisis of capitalism that really has been developing over the past decade, right? So certainly we can think about totalitarian governments and how they're using our digital devices to maybe suppress dissent and chill democracy, but we should be careful not to make an easy causal argument. I'm going to put my shade down here a little bit.
Okay.
And sorry if that was really bright. I couldn't see myself.
It was completely fine.
In the camera, fine, so I didn't see how bright it had gotten. The sun is right.
No, okay. It was fine. So we have this other question from Eudald. How do you think quantum computing can affect on controlling life of people and analyzing such a massive amount of data?
Well, quantum computing, and this is obviously beyond my expertise, but if we think about it in the context of machine learning and big data and how we're using algorithms to understand and process data, both to, study any number of things, right? We can use it to organize work. We can use it to understand, antibiotic resistance. We can use it to understand energy use, right? Big data and quantum computing are not necessarily good or bad. We don't need to immediately assign value to them. Instead, we have to understand how they're being used, right? To not allow this idea of technology to shape the agenda, but to say how actually are these things being used and who are the projects that they're being used and designed for. So when we're thinking about big data and algorithms, we have to say, well, how are these things designed? What are they being used for, right? And then to start asking questions about what's useful and what we should be doing with this data and not doing with it.
Okay. Lucas, do you believe that George Orwell's 1984 utopian world can be the final result of us living how we live, connected to everything?
Well, I think, and this is something that I tried to push back on, in my book and to allude to in this talk, is that I think that we should be cautious about how readily we adopt these digital devices into our life. We have to recognize the power relations that are inscribed in them. And so if we think about a book like 1984, which is an incredibly dystopian vision of power, right? And how technology is used to buttress totalitarianism. That's certainly a path that we could go down, right? If we're not conscious about the types of relationships that we're creating and recreating through our constant use of our devices and the norms and behaviors and expectations that go along with that. And often these norms and behaviors and expectations are shaped according to the desires of tech companies or governments who want to surveil us rather than our own sort of conscious desires. So I think being aware of this allows us to forge a different path, right? This is part of it. And I think that this is really starting to happen now, right? We're having these conversations and I talked about Block Sidewalk in Toronto, but that's just one example of a growing kind of pushback against the power of Silicon Valley companies to, put their vision of the future to substitute that vision for our own sort of collective democratic vision.
Okay. Andrea Cecilia, she asks, what do you think are the opportunities and risks that a smartphone society could have in the current fourth industrial revolution?
Well, that's a big question. So I think I talk a lot in the book. My main thrust is to get people to think about power and to encourage them to think about our society in a political way, to think about political relations, social relations, and how these undergird the types of economic decisions and structures that we have, right? To not see them as kind of inevitable, or to see technology, whether it's smartphones or other digital devices, as the driving force, right? To understand and put people in the driver's seat, and to understand that the arrangements that we have, whether they're with our phones or with, in our smart cities that are being developed, these are political questions and political relationships.
Okay. We have many questions about smart cities. We are going to start by this one by Luciana. Do you believe the shifting to smart cities will affect our way of interacting with people? Nowadays, only with the technology of smartphones, human interaction has been reduced a lot, she says.
Well, this is a great question, and I talk about this a little bit in different parts of the book. I think here, I don't hate technology, personally. I have a smartphone, and I use it all the time, but I'm also very cautious about how I use the phone. And so I think we have to be reflexive about our relationship, but not overemphasize the kinds of destructive power that digital technology can have on our own interpersonal relationships. So, for example, if you look at how people use their smartphones to interact with other people, it's not that we're seeing this huge fall off or decline in interpersonal interaction. And in fact, most people use their smartphones to connect with their family and friends who are closest to them, and it can actually have the effect of solidifying those relationships, particularly because neoliberal capitalism and the restructuring of labor markets over the past few decades has made it very hard for people to stay in their hometown. They have to move away. In the United States, this is particularly true to find work, and you're often separated from your family and close friends. So these kinds of devices actually can allow people to cement those kinds of ties. We can also think about people for whom their digital connection, right, their relationship to these kinds of cyber networks provides them with meaning and identity and connection that they wouldn't necessarily get at home, right? These are two positive ways. Now, we can, of course, also think about the potentially negative impacts, right, of our relationship to social media, the negative effects that can have on our identity, on our sense of self, and, our willingness to interact through the screen rather than in real life. These are things that, of course, we have to take seriously. And I think in this moment, right, the coronavirus moment, where there's a sense like, well, hey, this could be our future, right? We'll just connect with each other digitally. We'll do teaching online, right? We can get rid of classrooms and just connect virtually. This of course is a terrible idea, right? So we have to push back against these kinds of trends, which the goal is to reduce costs and reduce job security, right? So it's about finding a balance, and in doing this, we have to just, remain sober and in our fears about technology, right? Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Montserrat. She asked, what do you think will happen to countries where not everyone has access to technology and only a small part of the population will be able to benefit from these smart cities?
That's a great question. I recently wrote an article. I have 2 children, and when they were sent home from school, they were sent home with Chromebooks. Everyone in their school was sent home with a Chromebook, which is like a little Google notebook, and asked to connect with their teachers virtually every day to learn. And this, of course, is true in Spain, and it's true in China and countries around the world. But in the United States, and even in Massachusetts, where I live, not everyone actually has an internet connection or access to broadband internet at home, which means they're not able to connect with their teachers to learn. And in the United States, access to high-speed internet is very divided by class in terms of your ability to purchase it, and also by where you live. Large swaths of the country who live in rural areas are not able to access broadband internet at home. And this is a major problem because you can't apply for a job, you can't actually do research for school. It's very difficult to find information. So people end up relying on their smartphone as their only connection to the internet, which is far inferior from having broadband connection at home. So if we think about smart cities, right, are these only going to be cities for the rich? Are they only going to be cities that benefit a very small part of the population? Well, as they're being developed now, I think that's a real risk, right? As we see, huge parts of countries empty out because there are no jobs, there are no access. So this idea of the digital divide being exacerbated by smart cities is a really great question, and something that I think that needs to be explored more.
Okay. Well, we have many questions, but I'm going to pick up 2 more, and I think we can leave it here. Antonio Canovas, he asked, don't you think that the base of these smart cities should be our modern urban systems and applying those technologies as an approval of them, and not to create cities from nothing?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And I think it's also a great point because it's achievable, it's doable, right? We do want smart cities, and part of being smart is also being sustainable, right? So if we think about how do we actually make green cities, or make our living spaces so that they are not just destroying the planet. Well, cities are actually much better for the planet than people living out in, very spread out from each other. So we already have that. So if we are able to retrofit our cities, both in terms of digital access, right, but also retrofitting our buildings, to make them more environmentally friendly, right? We can do this without starting from scratch. People already live here. They already need to, have spaces that better fit their needs and are more sustainable in the long run. So yes, I think that that's a great point, and something that we should be pushing. Again, but this is, it's much harder for a tech company to come in and say, all right, Boston or New York City or Chicago or any of these smaller cities, it's much harder for them to come in and say, let's do everything the way that we want to do it, right? Then they'd have to actually negotiate. So the allure of building a new city from scratch is that they get to be the designers, and by extension, they get to have power over how the city runs.
Okay, so last question now from Belle. Do you think that collaborative life, both digital and social, will be reinforced after the coronavirus crisis?
I think that it could be. I think that this is, if we think about it, for me, I have a clear memory of the 2008 financial crisis because I'm a little older than all of you. So I'm imagining this as a kind of another shock to the system, right? The sense that, of course, we can't have this romantic notion that this will make things kind of collapse and something progressive and democratic will emerge from the ashes. But I think that there are a lot of conversations happening about solidarity and the need to actually collaborate, as the questioner mentioned, in a way that puts people before profits, right? And to think about actually designing systems, whether it's our response to the crisis or our need for a social safety net, to actually, put people first. And I think that there is a real potential for this. but there's also a potential, you know, and I'm thinking about this particularly in the United States, but elsewhere, as we see right-wing populist governments and totalitarian political views gaining currency, that if people are kind of left out in the cold, right? And Marcos, we were talking about this before we went on the air, right? If young people aren't able to find jobs, or people are not able to buy food, right, which are stark but real possibilities in the next year, after we see the scope of the devastation from this economic collapse. If people are left out in the cold, there's a real potential chance for a kind of right-wing backlash, which I think would really undermine any kind of collaborative kind of democratic you know, possibilities that could emerge from the crisis.
Okay, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for answering all these questions.
My pleasure.
Thank you for the lecture on behalf of our school. I would like now to invite Freddy Massat and Guillem Caraví to close the session.
Guillem.
Adelante, Freddy.
No, tú primero.
Okay, okay, Nicole, thank you very much for your interesting and intensive lecture. I hope, I don't know when, we can meet physically another time and continue to talk about this reality, our reality, the digital frontier.
Okay, yes. Sorry.
No, adelante, Freddy.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I want to say to the students that the questions are very good, and congratulations for the very interesting conference, and thank you for your time and for all the concept that you bring to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun, and thank you for the great questions, and for you students for listening and paying attention.
Okay, thank you. Muchas gracias, Marcos do Espíritu Santo, nuestro responsable de comunicación y voz visible y virtual de nuestros estudiantes. Gracias, Freddy. Y bueno, recordad que la próxima semana tendremos nuestra última invitada para cerrar el ciclo Co-Benefits, la arquitecta Elsie Obusu, que nos hablará sobre las posibilidades de cambio a la hora de afrontar desde la arquitectura y del arte el nuevo panorama que se plantea también después del COVID-19. Por lo tanto, una nueva conferencia de absoluta actualidad.
Bueno, nada, nos vemos el miércoles que viene a la misma hora, y gracias también de mi parte a Marcos, porque realmente hace un trabajo muy bueno, y esta cosa de seleccionar, leer las preguntas y todo está muy bien.
Bueno, me sabe mal, sí, tengo que hay muchas preguntas, selecciono aquellas que creo que pueden encaminar un poco el discurso del ponente, o sea que disculpas también a todos aquellos que hayan planteado alguna pregunta y que no haya entrado.
Igual se las pueden, como decía Nicole, se las pueden enviar a ellas vía mail y las responderá, así que todo lo que necesiten, y además busquen los libros y lean los que están muy bien.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos el miércoles. Gracias.
Gracias.